let's see. Okay. So I'll go ahead and get started here. You should have the handouts in the reminder email that you get from the GoToWebinar group. It has a link in the body of the email. If you read down, it says click here on this link for the handouts. And the handouts, I believe in this case, are just the slides. There might also be an example documentation packet, but in general, it should be mostly the slides. So if you didn't get the slides or you're unable to get that email opened up or what have you, then just shoot me an email after this and I will send you a copy of the slides and the handouts. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. And and one other thing, if you have questions, please ask as we go. There's a little like raise your hand button kind of thing or a questions area. You can just type questions into there, or you can raise your digital hand. Everyone's on mute so that we don't have a lot of crosstalk there. But as I said, if you type in a question, I will address it as we go so that everybody can benefit from your question. Okay, so we'll go ahead and move here. Oh, wait, one more thing. I'm going to do a quick bio. I got to do that every time. My name is Molly, in case you haven't done these webinars before, but Molly McCoy is my name. I am a CPO. I'm licensed in Washington, was licensed in Georgia. And then right now what I do is McCoy Consulting. That is my full-time job. I help other practitioners with their documentation to help improve writing skills, basically. It's kind of, it sounds kind of mundane, but it's actually super important for getting paid. So it really is about us as practitioners learning how to write in a way that insurers and patients and doctors can understand, and also about educating doctors on how they need to write notes as well. And those are tricky topics. They're also trippy, but anyway, so they're tricky things to learn, tricky things to get a hold of. So it is a full-time job doing that. So previous to this, I worked as a practitioner in Kentucky and as Director of Clinical and Technical Services at SPS. And then I also, after SPS, went back to clinical practice in my home state of Washington, and more recently taught lower extremity prosthetics at University of Washington prior to starting McCoy Consulting. So that's kind of my history. If you have any questions about me or my background or what have you, or any questions unrelated to this webinar, please do get a hold of me, and I'm happy to answer any of those for you. And then at the end, I'll give you some contact information. Okay, so as I say, the slides should be available in your handout, so you can follow along. But even if you don't have them, it's all in here, and you can download them later. So the overview is that we're going to talk about Cigna's policy. So a lot of these are based on Medicare policy, a lot of these webinars that I do. However, this one is based on Cigna for several reasons, because obviously Medicare isn't the only thing that you deal with every day. But also, it's really interesting to see how detailed the private insurers' policies are, and how they really give you background for how they've arrived at their decisions on what's covered and what isn't. So that's really interesting, and it can really help you when you're writing notes to make them more clear and to know what information they're looking for. So we're going to talk about Cigna's policy in this case, and then we're going to talk about the actual case that this is based on, the real patient and everything. Obviously, I've changed all the identifiers and that, so you don't know where it's from, who it's from, or any of that. But a shout out to the practitioner who agreed to let me use their case as the basis for this webinar. It's so amazing when people say, yes, if this is going to help other practitioners, please put it out there and let everybody see my documentation, see where I messed up, see where our problems are, so that they can learn from that and do better, just like we have. So awesome that they did that. And then the documentation that was submitted and how we changed it, and what the basis of creating this argument were. And then we're also going to have a little side note about getting better information from your patient. That's something I don't think we talk about very often, but it's actually it can be kind of difficult. And so we'll talk about maybe some tips on how to pry good information out of those patients in the short time that you have with them. And then we'll do a review. Okay, so jumping right into Cigna's policy. Cigna's policy on elevated vacuum is pretty specific, which is nice. It's evidence-based, which is kind of cool. However, it comes to a tricky conclusion. So if you look at Cigna's policy, I hope that's in the handouts. If it's not, I will forward it to you if you want it. But if you look at their policy on elevated vacuum, it basically says that they've looked at all the studies that they can find on it, and their conclusion is that the published evidence does not support clinical utility of this technology compared to conventional socket systems. So they're saying, we've seen the studies, we reviewed it based on that. And at the bottom there, you'll see the Washington State Department of Labor and Industries also published something that says that vacuum doesn't necessarily do better than a regular system anyway. So they're saying, based on all that information they've gathered, they don't feel that it's something that is better than regular suspension for folks. Does that mean that it's not covered? No, it absolutely means that it could be covered. However, so they're not saying we don't cover this, we don't pay for this. They're just saying we've seen studies. It doesn't say that this is good for everybody. So you are just going to have to present a killer argument to get us to pay for this. So they will pay for it. They have paid for it. This isn't something that they haven't seen before that they just automatically deny. They're just making it very clear to you in this policy that they are skeptical of this and that you need to present an argument that really makes sense for this patient and tell them how it's going to functionally help them every day, why it's needed over a regular suspension system for this patient. So it's totally doable, but they're telling you the burden is heavy to give them a good case. And then a tip on this is always, a tip that's always good to carry around is to have the policy beforehand. So when the patient calls up and says, I'm coming in, hopefully, if you've already seen the patient, you know the insurance they have. If you've discussed with them at all what they had prior, what they want to come in for, or what kind of different devices they're looking for, you can pull the policy ahead of time and be familiar with it. At the very least, after your initial appointment with them, you could at that point pull the policy and say, okay, now we've decided on elevated vacuum or whatever the technology is. Let's pull the policy on that and see what they say. And then if you don't have the information you need, you can bring the patient back in or call them on the phone or whatever you have to do to get more info. But at least you have the policy there and you can refer to it and you'll know what kind of data you need to gather. And so we're going to talk about that too in some detail. So the burden of proof in this one is pretty heavy, right? They're saying you really are going to have to show us some clear reasoning as to why this person needs this expensive and potentially less durable tech. Now, we know that it is more expensive than the standard suspension. However, if you can show real, tangible, functional benefits for the patient, it's okay that it's more expensive. It's just when we say, oh, this is more expensive and we want it and that's it, that doesn't really cut it. But when you give a good argument, they will pay for the extra cost usually or often. They also say it's less durable, and that is true of vacuum and of a lot of our higher tech components overall. However, there are ways to make it more durable. You certainly could make sure that you have a routine service plan, that patient agrees that they're going to come in and have that device looked at routinely and that you're going to document that, and that will absolutely extend the life of the device, and that they understand the care and use of that technology, whatever it is. So also, the burden in this case from the insurance company says that there's not enough research. They said they've looked at the research, right, that's out there, just like you have. So, and what they've said about that research is available is that it's small scale, which we know that, right, because everything in P&O is small scale as far as numbers of participants in research, especially. They also said that it's uncontrolled, and that's probably true too. It's really hard to do large, random, crossover controlled studies with our patient population. It just doesn't work very well. And that they have low statistical power and can't be generalized. So basically, whatever the outcome of that research is, if they say elevated vacuum is fabulous, it works for all these people, all you can do is say that it works for those people that participated in that study. You can't take that information and generalize it to all amputees. So for us to turn in a research paper with our documentation that says vacuum is fabulous, it heals everybody's wounds, it makes them walk better, it holds the suspension better, it's the best for everyone, doesn't make sense. When you look at the research, it doesn't work that way. So you want to be really careful that if you are going to send in a bunch of research papers with your documentation, that might be okay. But in this case, sending those in without any explanation or any link to your notes or any call outs about the document or the research itself won't help you, because again, Cigna has said, we know the research, we've seen the research, and they'll give you a list of the research papers. If you look at it, it's all the research papers you're going to see from the manufacturers that they send out or that they have on their websites. So they're saying, we've read all that and we don't feel like it's helpful. So for you to not be familiar with that and then send in a bunch of research papers that you get off the manufacturer's websites, it's not a good idea. Having said that, is research useful in billing? In this case, it can be, but it plays a very, very small role. So the one example I could think of is, let's say you find a research paper that has 3 subjects, right? 3 people that took part in the research. And that research in the end concludes that vacuum is wonderful. It works great. And it's going to cure all the patient's problems. That's fine, but only if, let's say, those 3 research participants match your patient's profile. They're all men and your patient's a man. They're all short transtibial amputees, and your patient's a short transtibial amputee, has a short transtibial amputation, I should say, not overall stature. But if they have a short residual limb, and these people in the study have a short residual limb, the lifestyle is similar, they're very active adults, and your patient is a very active adult, then you can say, look, this research, while not generalizable to everyone that wears a prosthesis, it is generalizable to my patient because the subjects match my patient. And so you can say that those research results are likely to be seen in your patient as well. So you can see that's pretty small area, that's pretty nuanced, and you'd want to be very, very familiar with that research study. And I'm not sure a lot of us have time to spend really digging into the details of all that research. If you do, and this happens to be an area that you love and you're really familiar with those research studies, then great, that's one way you can use it. But again, just be careful not to throw a bunch of studies at your insurer, because it doesn't always help you out. And then that last line, why wouldn't a conventional work? That's sort of what you want to ask yourself every time with this kind of technology. Always ask the question that the reviewer is going to be asking. So you're going to put on your reviewer hat and say, what does this technology have that will functionally benefit my patient, this patient right now, over a regular lower tech device? And you need to have, some really good solid reasons that the lower tech won't work and this will work. What problems does it solve? What functional benefit does this guy get because of whatever's going on for him specifically? So also, if you're using templates, I know I beat the template horse to death in a few of the prior webinars, but I do think it's just super important. Watch out that your template has enough detail. In this particular case, these folks used a template that is actually 7 pages long. It was a very long, fairly thorough template. However, one, it wasn't filled out all the way in this particular case, which is common, right? We get to the point where we're sort of checking boxes madly and not really filling in the detail around it. So you have to be careful of that. But in this case, the template didn't really have any areas where this practitioner could specify what about vacuum was important. There was one little box that said, okay, does this person need elevated vacuum? And the checkbox was yes, but there was no explanation as to why. So using a template is absolutely fine, but if it doesn't gather the right detail, it might not support your claim. So you have to be careful with that, and make sure that you're fleshing it out, giving it some background detail, and really explaining it in more specifics. And then do your notes explain your choices, right? You've chosen to get out elevated, to shoot for elevated vacuum with this person. What is the problem that vacuum is going to solve, right? What issues does this person have that vacuum is the only answer for? And why won't conventional do it? Have they tried conventional before? Have they tried just a regular pin and lock suspension and it didn't work out for them? Have they tried sleeve suspension and it wasn't right? What has not worked in the past, and why do we think elevated vacuum is going to do it? And surprisingly, that's not in many of the notes that, at least that I see from practitioners. And I know it wasn't in my notes back in the day when I was doing vacuum in clinic. There just wasn't that much detail because, again, hasn't been needed until recently. So this is a new world of documentation for sure. Does the patient understand why they need this? This is one that so many people forget or that doesn't get addressed. the patient really needs to understand what the vacuum, the elevated vacuum or whatever high technology you're using, what does that do for them? What problem does it solve and how is it going to help them? If they understand it, then they are their own advocate. They will fight for it. So if you say to that patient, look, you come in here with the problem of of having a sore on your anterior distal tibia for 3 years, an open wound on your anterior distal tibia for 3 years. I think vacuum is going to solve that problem for you. And let me tell you why. And you can explain it however you want to explain it. Remember to keep jargon out of that if you can, and explain it in real plain terms. But you explain it to them. And now all of a sudden they are saying, wow, it's going to get rid of that sore potentially. That's great. I really want this technology. I want to make it work. They'll take that information to their doctor. They'll be an advocate for that vacuum system to their insurer, and they can be a really powerful help to you in getting things like this covered. So keep in mind that you really need to spend time educating your patient about what this technology is doing for them, not just that it's cool or it's the latest thing, but how it's really going to help them functionally. And then what are the medical issues? This case that we're going to talk about specific to vacuum today, I really love because it has a real specific medical problem that vacuum could help address. And so that's huge. A lot of times we don't look at their overall medical picture. What medications are they on? What other medical issues do they have? And could vacuum be a part of helping with that? Or could whatever technology you're going to use on that patient be a part of helping with that? And if you don't understand the medications or you're not sure if what you're doing is going to help with whatever medical issue that person has, then just check with the doctor, and say, look, this is how this technology works, in this case, vacuum. Do you think that would help the patient in this way? Do you agree with me? Seems to me that it would. And just kind of get the doctor's okay. Now that's separate from what the doctor says in their notes. This is just you vetting out your idea with the doctor. And if you can do that, that's excellent. I know not always. I know that usually doctors aren't so keen on having a long conversation, but if you can cut it down and have a quick conversation with them, it's helpful. Okay, so let's talk about the actual case. Again, I love this case. I think it really is stuff, it has a lot of aspects to it that you probably see in your practices day to day. So that's really great. It's very, very relevant to folks. This person's a 53-year-old male. He's an avionics technician. Why that's huge will become clear later, but it's kind of a big deal. And then he also rides motorcycles and he boats. He has a boat and he gets out there on that. So those are all great. But I think, in this case, this person is a young, active adult who's still working and has insurance from their work. So again, separating this from Medicare, you're not often going to talk about a person's job so much with Medicare. You're going to talk more about their getting back into the swing of life or having community involvement. In this case, we want to focus on this person's work life because, again, the insurance is from the employer, and also because when you're young and you're working, the insurance is meant to keep you working. So we want to focus on that in this case. He's also a right transtibial amputee. The amputation was 4 years ago due to tumor. And so he's got a very short residual limb. Now I put that in quotes because in the notes it says very short residual limb. And I just want to throw out there a side note that to a reviewer who maybe isn't as familiar with P&O, very short residual limb doesn't mean much. So you think, okay, well, we'll give a measurement. It's a 4-inch residual limb. Well, I'm just not sure that reviewer is going to take a ruler, put it on their, on their leg and measure out 4 inches and go, wow, that is really short, right? You're not sure if they'll do that. But if you put a picture in there, and there's one I believe it's in the Atlas of amputations, amputation and the Atlas, whatever, the prosthetics Atlas, if you look in there, or it's in one of your textbooks from school, if you can pull those out or have one of your residents pull that out. There's a picture of a limb and it's got short, very short, long, extremely long, or something like that labeled out. And then it shows the level of amputation for each of those. So I think it's really helpful when you have a very short residual limb to put something like that, a picture like that in there to help the reviewer visualize that, look, this is actually, when I say very short residual limb, I'm telling you there is not a lot of anatomy to grab onto here, and it's a big deal. And a visual like that can just be so helpful. It's very powerful for them to see, oh, this is a standard residual limb length, and you're talking about a very short, that's pretty tiny. So Anyway, I hope to have that page scanned in and available. If you want that going forward, you can email me and I'll post it somewhere, and I'll email it back to you or whatever. But it's a really helpful picture, I think, for reviewers. And then the person's in this case, the person's current prosthesis is 3 years old and he already has vacuum suspension. So it's something he's been wearing for a while. But right now, the vacuum that he has is not holding. The pump has been rebuilt one time already, and the liners and sleeves are worn out, which is pretty understandable. After 3 years, they're going to be worn out. So that's kind of the overview of the case. And so the first thing that the practitioner in this case wanted to document was the wear and tear on the prosthesis, which makes perfect sense. Again, it's been 3 years and 3 months. I know there's been some information out there, which is absolutely true. Let me be very clear about the reasonable useful lifetime of the RUL of prosthetics being unlimited. Like, you don't have to worry about a reasonable useful lifetime with prosthetics. That is technically very true, as long as the doctor documents that the person needs a new prosthesis and that there's wear and tear, or there's a physiological change or irreparable damage, all of that kind of stuff. As long as the doctor documents that in their chart, there is no reasonable useful lifetime, or RUL, on a prosthesis. But if the notes that you get from the doctor don't specifically outline that, then the standard reasonable useful lifetime of the device applies, and that's 5 years. So if you get documentation from the doctor that says this person needs a new prosthesis because they've had a physiological change or there's wear and tear, and let me be clear that in this case we did have that. If you get that documentation, then great. The 3 years and 3 months issue is not an issue, because there is no reasonable useful lifetime in that case. But if we got documentation from the doctor that just said, the person's on this medication, person wants a prosthesis, or blah, 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 or maybe it's just not very specific, then they could apply. Technically, they could apply the reasonable useful lifetime and say, well, it's only been 3 years and 3 months. Why does he need another one? So you have to be kind of careful. Of course, Medicare always leaves themselves an out, right? And this in this case, we're talking about Cigna, and they might not be as strict. And do they have reasonable useful lifetime? It depends on the policy. But in general, you just want to be careful that you don't just throw it out there that, oh, it doesn't matter that it's 3 years and 3 months. It kind of does matter that it's been a short time with this person. Now, in this case, we have a really good reason. This is a very active person. He's really using his prosthesis all the time, and he's using it in really difficult environment. So that's all a really good thing that he's worn it out in this time. And we're going to sort of address that in the notes, right? What is the damage to the prosthesis specifically? Again, our argument here is that the wear and tear has caused this prosthesis to wear out and we need a new one. So if that's the case, we better be specific about what wear and tear we're talking about. What's wrong with this prosthesis? What is the damage? So in this particular case, the notes were not very specific about what the issues were. There was some in there, but not much detail. And so what I would say is, if you're going to make the argument that you need a new one because of wear and tear, you really give some details about what the damage is and how it happened, right? So what is the damage? In this case, it was a leaking socket and worn out sleeves and liners. But worn out, what does that mean, right? What that means in this case is the person actually had some holes in the liners, and those holes were causing little blisters or little skin irritation right where the holes and the cracks were. That's something you want to put in there. It's not just that they're worn out and they don't, and they look bad, or they're worn out and they smell or something like that. It's really they're worn out and they're causing skin issues. So that's something we want to detail. The leaking socket is a problem because that won't hold vacuum. And we really have to be clear about that. Leaking socket doesn't mean anything to a reviewer. They don't know that means that the pump is going to run all the time and run the battery down, then it doesn't work, right? So you need to outline that. And then the cause of damage. Was it from boating? Was it work? Was it motorcycles? What was it that caused this? And how are we going to prevent it from happening again really quickly? They could say, maybe this person isn't really a candidate for this high tech because he's worn it out so quickly because of his active lifestyle. We want to make sure to point out that he is going to continue to be active because he's able to wear vacuum, has that really great suspension. So he can participate in all these healthy activities that are really important to his overall health and well-being. And of course, work for him. Again, in a slide or two here, we're going to really dive deep into that work issue. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here. And how will you prevent that similar damage? This is kind of the above and beyond. If you want to really, hit it out of the park with these notes, you could really explain that, look, this person does have a very active lifestyle and has a very demanding work environment. And therefore, we're going to do these extra things to make sure that this prosthesis lasts as long as possible, and kind of discuss that. Okay, so then the documentation in this case, again, we really want to, hammer on things specific to this particular patient. Does his job require this super suspension, and why? And again, we're going to talk about that. It does. He's an avionics technician. It happens to be like the perfect job for elevated vacuum, in my opinion. But so in this case, he most certainly does need it for that. And then this is an interesting one. The clinical utility over conventional for this patient also is important because of the short residual limb that he has and the fact that he's on Xarelto. If you're not familiar with Xarelto, it's something we'll discuss here in a slide coming up, but it can have effects, and it can be a factor in how the residual limb fits and how it works and how well the residual limb does, in the prosthesis. So because he's on that medication, that's important to note as far as our justification for vacuum. And then for this particular patient, limb volume maintenance isn't so much an issue, even now with a broken, or even at that time with a broken suspension with a broken vacuum pump that wasn't working. He still didn't have big volume fluctuations. So that wasn't, or even, I shouldn't say big, because obviously if they have huge swings in volume, you're not going to be using vacuum anyway. But even moderate changes in volume were not a problem for this particular patient. But we will talk about those that have some limb volume changes and use of vacuum for those folks. Okay, so what is the effectiveness of this particular technology for this patient? So back to the Cigna policy, what their policy says, again, just to remind you, is that customizing prosthetic devices with enhanced features is not medically necessary if ADLs can be met with standard devices. So again, here's our burden of proof that we have to show that a standard device is not going to cut it for him at work or at home in his ADLs. So that just kind of gives us a hint about where we're going. So in this case, he's an avionics technician. Well, when the practitioner asked him, what do you do for a living? He said, I'm an avionics technician. And he said, what does that mean for you? What kind of job, what do you do during the day on that job? Well, I, install things into planes. Okay. I don't know what that means. I haven't necessarily seen that as a practitioner. And so you ask the patient, well, what does that involve? Going on the plane and putting things in the plane. Okay. It's not giving us much detail, right, about how we can use that, how we can use his job as justification. So what you can do, and what I think is a really helpful thing to just have in your toolkit of documentation tricks, is to go on to the U.S. Department of Labor ONET website. It's called ONET Online, although that looks like 1-2 line or something, but it's ONET Online, and it's an actual listing of, I swear, every job at all that's ever been invented ever is on this site. It's crazy how thorough it is. But the Department of Labor has an outline of every job that you can think of, what it involves physically, what it involves mentally, what it involves schooling wise. And of course, for us, that section on what it physically involves is huge. So in this case, with the guy being an avionics technician, it outlined that he really the ONET website outlined in very specific terms that he has physical activities to perform at work. And that includes climbing, lifting, balancing, walking, stooping, handling of materials, that kind of stuff. And then it also outlined that he needs to be able to keep or regain his balance when in an unstable position. He's going to have to twist and reach with his arms, legs, and body and be in these, potentially laying down. He's often laying down or sitting inside the plane. And that's huge because you can imagine if he gets his toe caught as he's getting up, he could easily leave the prosthesis behind. And it's not going to be a simple thing to go back and grab the prosthesis if it's in the wing of a plane or if it's, fallen down into some crack or crevice of this stripped out plane. So again, having a really solid suspension in this case is extremely important because he's going to be dragging that prosthesis around. He's really relying on it to get out of these weird positions that he's going to have to get in to install these devices. The reason I say for you to go onto the U.S. Department of ONET website and pull this down is because it can really be a helpful way for you to help the patient describe what they do. So, it makes me think of my accountant, right, who says, I want to know every penny that you've spent throughout the year. And he says, what did you spend your money on? And I think, I don't know. It's been a year. I don't know what I spent it on. But if he says, here's a list of things that people similar to you have spent their money on throughout the year, could you tell me which one of these is you? Now I can give him some really good detailed information. Now I could say, oh, yes, of course, yes, I do that. But when you do it every day, it's hard to remember the detail. So something like this description, this job description, this physical description of the job, giving that to the patient and walking through it with them and saying, wow, do you get down on your knees and stoop and bend? You do? Great, circle that. Or, can I give you this list to take home and you can sort of make notes as to, how much of this is what you do on a daily basis, or, anything like that, something to really help the patient to get them to explain what they do in some extreme detail so that you can use that for your justifications. Can be super helpful. So keep that in mind. So anyway, I love that one because with the avionics technician, it was so perfect. He happened to be really the perfect candidate for elevated vacuum based on his work requirements. So that was really helpful. And then we're going to have to talk about, as far as Cigna is concerned, you're going to have to talk about the clinical utility over a conventional device. Again, they're just saying, what really is the functional benefit of this technology over a standard prosthesis. In this case, our patient had that very short residual limb. So we're going to outline in the notes that the reason we need vacuum over conventional is because prior to using vacuum, he had a standard prosthesis and he had a skin breakdown issue. Also, his current leg doesn't have vacuum because it's broken and he's had skin issues from that. We also need to distribute forces over the entire limb, especially because when we're talking about a very short residual limb, we don't have a lot of surface area to grab onto. We don't have a lot of surface area to distribute forces over. So we need to maximize that surface area and we need to use every bit of it. And we can do that if we have a solid vacuum suspension. And again, you can explain that for that reviewer, make sure it's clear that that's really an important piece of requiring vacuum. And then we would just really need to eliminate shear and socket movement on this person because it's a short residual limb, because we don't have a lot of surface area to distribute forces, but also because this person's on Xarelto. So Xarelto is a medication that people take for various reasons. It's often used to prevent deep vein thrombosis and pulmonary embolism. So, blood clotting issues. Because this gentleman had cancer, he was on some medications for that, and he had issues around that. And because of that, he ended up with that amputation. So all of that kind of contributed, and now he's on Xarelto for an extended period of time. He's going to have to use this drug for many years. The side effects of Xarelto, and again, this isn't in the practitioner's notes, but when you look at that medication list, you can do a 10-second search. I mean, it's so fast. Even if the medication list is 20 medications long, you can jump on Google, you can quickly scan through those medications and say, okay, does this have any effect on the prosthesis? Is this going to be, anything I need to address? In the case of Xarelto, it comes up that the side effects are bruising, skin blisters, collection of clotted blood in the tissues, and all this kind of thing. And it makes you think, well, shoot, if he had a really loose suspension, or he had a suspension that allowed a lot of pistoning or allowed a lot of maybe bell clapping or something like that in the prosthesis, would that be an issue considering he's on Xarelto? It seems like it would be, but just to double check, this is where you call the doctor and say, look, based on the fact that Xarelto has these particular side effects, do you feel like a suspension that isn't as secure could potentially cause some bruising or skin blisters on his residual limb? And just, double check. And if the doctor's like, yeah, I think it probably could, any kind of mechanical damage to the skin could be a real problem on Xarelto, then you've just sort of cemented that idea. You're not going to then put in your notes, doctor says that this is a problem. You don't want to say that. You just want to sort of vet out that idea before you put it in your notes. And then you can say, the side effects of Xarelto are this. we could have issues with loose suspension if we're not careful. So it's another reason to consider vacuum for this person to make sure that we don't have any skin issues going forward. So it's just kind of an out of the box thing, something that can really help you. And again, when you're looking to get something covered that's expensive and that the insurance company is saying they really want a lot of information about, as in this case, then you want to go ahead and just get in there like a detective and find any little piece of information that's going to support your claim and get it in there and just give them a solid argument. Okay, and in this case, this patient did not have a limb volume management issue, however, or maintenance issue. However, if you have patients that do have some issue with volume change for medications, and again, we're not talking about huge, 55 ply swings here. We're talking about, moderate changes in limb volume throughout the day that can cause skin irritation or problems with suspension. Then you'd want to note that for your patients. So if they're on some kind of medication that could potentially give them issues with swelling or with loss of volume during the day, then you could address that in your argument for vacuum. And then if that is going to be an argument that you use, make sure you give some evidence for that. The patient, if again, talking about a different patient here, if patient comes in, you think they need vacuum because they're having some volume fluctuation, minor volume fluctuation from some medication, then you'll want to track their daily sock changes. And you'll want to give specific problems with the prior suspension. So if they come in using pin and liner suspension, and that's been a problem for them because they have to change their socks during the day, but because of their job or because of their lifestyle, that's a real hassle for them, then you want to track how often they're having to change and what happens if they don't change their socks. If they don't add socks during the day, they end up with a sore, they end up with, skin damage or what have you. So something to sort of address. And like I said, give some evidence. So when you're thinking about doing vacuum, think ahead on that and get some information about the past usage and the daily use of the current prosthesis to build your case for vacuum. So, okay. And then this is a side note that came up in this case, because again, in this case, the patient was really not very helpful in explaining how his job requires the use of elevated vacuum. So we got to thinking, well, how can you get someone to give you some more information without sitting there during your, whatever hour, if you're lucky, 45 minutes, if it's more common, appointment time, and, drilling every little bit of information out of them, or, putting them on the hot seat and saying, okay, what do you do at 8:30 in the morning? What do you do at 8:35 in the morning? What do you do? You don't want to do that with patients, and it's awkward for everybody. It doesn't work, right? But we still need to get some real fine detail about their life. So what can you do to get that information without stressing the patient out and without using up your appointment time to do it? Some ideas that you can use to describe their current prosthetic issues, if that's the case that you're in, if they already have a prosthesis and you want to describe the issues that they're having, what you need to address. Try giving them something like the PEQ, or the Prosthetic Evaluation Questionnaire. That's available online. It's free. You can use it. It's validated, so insurers like that. Day to day, I'm not sure it's all super important to have that, but that's my personal opinion. But anyway, it does help the patient kind of explain their issues without saying, well, it hurts. And you're like, well, why does it hurt? How does it hurt? I don't know. It just hurts. You fix it. We need some more detail about that. And this can help them give us more detail. It also helps the patient understand their issues at a deeper level, their issues with their prosthesis and why they want to change at a deeper level, so that when they talk to their doctor, they actually have something to say and they can explain with some detail about what's going on. They could even take that questionnaire in with them to the doctor and say, look, these are the problems I've been having with my prosthesis. This is why I want a new one. And it can really help them have a discussion with their doctor. And just to be clear, if they're having a discussion with their doctor about the problems with their prosthesis, the doctor's going to document that. Now you've got documentation ahead of time for why you need a new one. So it's a big deal. And then you can use it for clinical decision making. Again, if you have more information about what the patient's experiencing, you're better able to make those clinical decisions. And then the key here is that you could send that to the patient ahead of time. So you can send it to them in the mail ahead of their appointment. that way they can fill it out at home. They can do it with the wife or the husband or the cousin or whoever to help them sort of answer those questions. And they're really thinking about what's going on with their prosthesis before they come in to see you, so that, again, you can have a more efficient conversation with more information that you need. So that's really big. Or if you didn't get it to them ahead of time, they can take it with them after that first appointment and be working on it ahead of the next one, which is also helpful. The drawbacks to the PEQ and specifically are that it's super long. If you've ever used it before, I want to say it's like almost 20 pages, maybe 15 pages. It's super long. You can break it down into the sections you need. So it can be, you just pull out section 2 and section 4. But every time I've given it to a patient in clinic, I've said, look, this is super long. Take your time with it. I've never had anyone complain about it. They all had come back to me and said, it was long, it was tedious, but I did it over a few days. And I really appreciate that you're trying to get this kind of detailed information. It makes me feel like the care is better. So, and honestly, I'm telling you that very truthfully, that every patient I gave it to in clinic felt that way about it. So, that's anecdotal, but it seemed to be, I was worried about giving them something so long, and none of them had an issue with it. Or a lot of them would say, I just skipped some of it because it was too long for me or whatever, but it wasn't bothering me at all that you asked me to fill it out or whatever. So anyway, it can be helpful that way, but it's a little long. It can be a pain in the butt to score. So after you do it the first time, it gets to be a breeze, but that first time can be kind of tricky. You have to read a long instruction set that is worded, in my opinion, a little awkwardly. But once you get the hang of it, you're like, oh, okay, if that's all they mean, that's easy. And it can be a little tricky to photocopy. You have to be careful about not changing the size of it when you photocopy it. Just keep that in mind. So there are some drawbacks to the PEQ, but overall it could be really valuable to you for getting some good information. An alternative to a PEQ, if you're not into all that, or you try it and it's not working for you, is to just do your own questionnaire. Now that wouldn't be validated scientifically, so that's a little bit of a drawback, but again, in my humble opinion, that's a small drawback, because really the way you're using this is not to scientifically validate your opinions or your clinical decisions. It's to gather more information and get the patient thinking about their prosthesis in detailed terms. So if you wanted to make your own to give to the patient before that first appointment or after the first appointment and bring it back with them, whatever, you're still going to get all those benefits that we talked about earlier, as far as the patient being able to really spend some time on it, get info from family and friends, not take up your appointment time with gathering this kind of detail. You'd still get all that benefit. And if it's not validated, it's unofficial, and that's okay. You still would get some good, valuable information out of it, and you still have all those benefits. So something to think about if you wanted to give your patients some questionnaires, again, to help them with that gathering information. Okay, so we're done a little early. That's convenient. That's nice. So in review of what we just talked about, the overall clinical policy in this case with Cigna, with elevated vacuum, gave some really great detail about what information we needed to gather as practitioners to get this thing paid for. So that was really helpful. And it's something we never would have known had we not looked at the policy and realized that they had some good detail on it. And then the case in this case really gave us some good information and some good techniques to use on many other patients. So understanding what the patient needs in detail is not that easy, but there are some tricks to do it. And then, of course, the documentation. We really need to address the requirements of the policy. And again, if you don't know the policy, you can't address the requirements, and you've got weak documentation. It's not going to help you out. And then we need to give them that needed information. Again, I would say what we don't want to do is just send in our notes and a pile of research studies from the manufacturer and call it good. That's not going to be sufficient in most cases, and especially in this case with Cigna. But this is the case with most insurers, that their policies are similar, where that's just not going to cut it to send in a bunch of random information. Okay. So that's the whole thing. Hopefully that was helpful. I just want to thank SPS. They make it possible for me to provide these webinars at no charge to everybody, and make it possible for me to spend all day reading policy so you don't have to. And so we appreciate them doing that. It's a service they offer for their customers that's hopefully very valuable. And then if you have questions or comments, ideas, anything like that, please do get a hold of me. Here's all my contact information. That phone number that you see there rings to my cell phone. So you'll almost every time get me directly. If not, again, it'll leave a message on my cell, so I'll get right back to you. And then this is the Twitter handle or Twitter feed that you can use. I don't tweet much, but I try to more and more. So if you're on Twitter, that's an option. And then again, this email address goes straight to me. So if you have questions or comments, you can send it there. So very much appreciate your